and in that darkness, only the sound of 3 pairs of legs could be heard scrambling from the glass ceiling, which was now their only escape. Instead, it was like something had a grip on her foot and was holding her fast. Kevin grunted and pulled, and something tore as Lisa slid upward and started through the hole. And the horrified Kevin and Lisa backed away slowly. Roger shuffled along with his arms stretched out before him, the dark glimmer of fog obscuring his vision almost entirely. Above his head he could see only 4 or 5 stars, and their dim light was not strong enough to show him the way. The rest of the sky was blotted out by the oppressive black clouds which lay as thick and impenetrable as the fog in which he wandered. Initially, he moved along and kept his right hand against the side of the tomb, shuffling along its peripheral wall. But he tripped on something and he couldn't see, and then stumbled. And the moment his hand left the cold bricks of the mausoleum, the entire structure seemed to vanish into the mist. And as hard as he tried, Roger found himself unable to rediscover it. Sweat began to trickle down his head, and he felt it drip down his back, thick beads of condensed nerves that did no favors for his anxiety. With nothing else to do, Roger slowed his pace but continued moving. After a while, he found the ground becoming far less sturdy. It was as if he'd wandered over into some junkyard with a manner of strange objects littered across the ground. Except that whatever it was, which kept tripping him up, was too dark to properly see. He could tell that the objects were hard and thin, and they were made of odd clattering sounds as he kicked them. But there were more and more, as if he was approaching the source of the mess. Just like a junkyard, his nose and mouth were assaulted by a pungent odor, first agitating but quickly becoming disorientating, and finally near devastating. It was so bad that Roger had to raise his hand to his nose and pull his shirt up over his mouth. Ever so steadily, the fog began to clear. No, not clear exactly, but to brighten up, going from black to a dark gray and finally into a shimmering silver with hints of pale and even white. As the fog started to change, the strange objects at his feet became less and less numerous, and what little he could make out looked like a little more than shattered pieces of white clay or plaster, most in minuscule portions but some in strange shapes, long and thin like uncarved forks that were far too long for any practical use. The fog eventually became completely white, but as its hue became more pleasant, its thickness became even more frustrating. In some places, the fog took on an almost physical component, and soon the ghostly visage of a tall, thin tree started looming into view. Roger was becoming nervous at this point, as most of the cemetery had been devoid of trees, and no part of the trees placed as closely together as he was seeing in this portion of it. Curious at the shining patch of one tree, he walked closer to investigate. He suspected it may have been a little more than the sprung faucet of a dripping sap, moving its excruciatingly slow passage toward the ground. He touched the tree, and his hand came back sticky, confirming his suspicions. He decided he should backtrack and see if he could find the mausoleum there. Unfortunately, the sap on the tree he touched proved itself to be far greater a bond than he expected, and his hand became firmly attached. He pulled and he wrenched, and finally, with a moderate amount of physical pain, his hand came from the plant. It was time to leave. It was a dark evening, and his companions needed him. The odor was beginning to dissipate, so it was time to quit exploring and resume their plan. Muttering underneath his breath, Roger then turned to make a course to the right, which would have likely have been heading south. But his body froze without warning, coming to a dead stop in his tracks. It only took him a few seconds to realize that the reason his body had lost all momentum was because he was stuck. And to make matters worse, he could easily recognize the reason why he was stuck. He was standing in the center of an enormous spiderweb strung between 2 trees. He'd heard of such things in orchards, where massive amounts of spiders spun webs that covered whole groves, looking like a silvery mesh meant to protect the fruit, leaves, branches, and limbs. But in the cases he'd seen, The webs were haphazard and heaped upon each other, as if the spiders were warring for territory. Here, it was far different. Cleaner, purer, as if one spider alone had meticulously crafted this massive web. And it was thick, too. Thick enough that the more he fought, the more enmeshed in the web he became. And as he squirmed and fought, he came to the dreaded realization that it didn't matter whether or not his sneakers could touch the forest floor. He couldn't get the momentum or the thrust to free himself. He strained and grunted with all his might, trying to pull in his outstretched arms, but it's as if they were shackled out in the pattern of crucifixion. Only here, those cold nails were wispy mesh that wrapped around him tighter and tighter with every heave and every hoe. At last, he stopped and tried to catch his breath. He breathed hard, gasping for air, and finally decided to steady his breathing and focus on the forest around him. What if the spiders that made this are poisonous? He began to think, and a tremor went through his body as the vision of him spasming in his last convulsive moments as blood and spittle oozed out of his mouth, slowly asphyxiating him. He had to free himself. But before he could exercise any renewed vigor, something in the fog caught his eyes. There was a deformity on the tree about 20 feet away, an odd, bulbous, growing shape, as if the tree was developing a massive tumor on its side. He squinted, trying to see by the enigmatic light of the mist. The tumor twitched, turning, rotating on the tree. And then, as if it sensed his perception, it began to bulge out and move slowly down the tree. To Roger, it brought to his mind the memory of his younger brother crawling around under the rug when he was 2 years old. But whatever the bulge was, as it reached the ground, it broke away from the tree, and he realized it was far less ideal than a toddler. And as thin, spindly legs rose up and spread out in all directions, he realized, with a cold weight in his stomach, that there was nothing beneath the bulge. The odd shape was actually the body which had produced his silky chains. It scuttled closer, and every few feet, more of it would become more visible. He could see the legs in greater clarity, how each one broke in 4 separate places in order to fan out like a parachute. He could see the bulbous body was actually 2 segmented pieces connected on adjoining sides, and he could see a third, smaller body, and a series of black dots that covered the face above the twitching mandibles the size of Roger's arms. He could see the hairs that grew thick across its body of this creature, but most jarring of all was the point that the rear segment tapered off into, the point which likely held the venom that Roger feared. Or perhaps something far, far worse than this creature was carrying, a brood of young ready to enter this horrid new world. There was a clicking off to his left, and Roger tore his gaze away from the monstrosity to see, with a terrifying reality, that more trees were covered in similar tumors. There had to be at least half a dozen of them, and they were beginning to twitch and rotate like the one which now came within mere feet of him. These two were shuffling towards the ground and scuttling across the freshly mown grass, and towards the web that held Roger aloft between 2 trees. The creature nearest him reached out with its nearest segmented leg and brushed tentatively against Roger's right leg, causing him to cry out and pull away. It backed away with a speed that surprised and alarmed him, and then relaxed. It reached out for the web to his left and started to pull itself up, off the ground and parallel to him. All Roger could see was the stinger beginning to throb, and he turned to his right, staring, tears welling up in his eyes.
"Help me!"
He stammered.
"Help me, please!"